For decades, Pattie Boyd was known as the muse behind some of the most iconic love songs in rock history. She was the woman who inspired George Harrison's Something and Eric Clapton's Layla, two of the greatest declarations of love ever written. But behind those romantic melodies was a story filled with heartbreak, betrayal, and secrets that the world never truly knew. Now, at 81, Pattie Boyd is finally breaking her silence about her marriage to George Harrison, the quiet Beatle who, despite his spiritual calm, hid a far more complicated side than anyone imagined. Their relationship began like a fairy tale. A Beatle falling head over heels for a stunning model he met on the set of A Hard Day's Night. The two quickly became one of Britain's most glamorous couples, living a life surrounded by fame, fortune, and the mysticism of the late 1960s. But as the years went on, cracks began to appear behind the perfect facade. George's deepening spiritual quest and long absences began to pull them apart, while Pattie struggled to find her place in his increasingly distant world. For years, Pattie kept quiet, protecting George's image and shielding herself from public scrutiny. But time and truth have a way of surfacing. In her recent reflections, she reveals what life was really like living beside a man adored by millions but emotionally unreachable to the one who loved him most. From affairs and heartbreak to forgiveness and peace, Pattie's revelations paint a portrait not of scandal, but of survival, and of a woman who finally learned to reclaim her own story after living in the shadow of legends. When Pattie Boyd first laid eyes on George Harrison in 1964, she couldn't have imagined how that moment would change the course of her entire life. She was just 19, a bright, fresh-faced model who had been cast in A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles' first feature film. George, quiet and reserved compared to his bandmates, was immediately captivated. Amid the chaos of Beatlemania, he saw something in Pattie, a calm, radiant beauty that stood out from the screaming crowds. It was George who made the first move, shyly asking her out to dinner. Pattie, though flattered, initially declined. She already had a boyfriend. But fate has a way of reshaping even the firmest plans. Soon after, she found herself saying yes, stepping into a love story that would define an era. Their relationship blossomed quickly, and in 1966 they married in a small ceremony that marked one of the few private moments in their very public lives. At first, it was pure magic. They bought a house in Esher, Surrey, where musicians, mystics, and celebrities flowed in and out. The Beatles were at their creative peak, and George's fascination with Indian music and spirituality was growing stronger by the day. Pattie supported him wholeheartedly. She was there when he met Ravi Shankar and began his lifelong journey into meditation and the search for enlightenment. To the outside world, they were the embodiment of 1960s glamour, young, beautiful, and in love, wrapped in music and mysticism. But even in those early years, there were hints that their love was not as perfect as it seemed. George's growing fame made him distant, more consumed by his art and his inner journey than the woman waiting at home. Pattie adored him, but often found herself feeling invisible, just another figure orbiting around the blinding light of Beatlemania. She once described their home as a temple to silence, where George would spend hours meditating while she wandered through rooms filled with the faint hum of sitars and incense. Friends of the couple often remarked how Pattie seemed lonely, despite being married to one of the most famous men in the world. While George's music deepened with spiritual meaning, his marriage began to lose its connection to earthly love. The man who had written Something, one of the most beautiful love songs ever penned, was becoming increasingly distant from the woman who inspired it. By the end of the 1960s, as the Beatles fractured and George immersed himself in his solo career, the cracks in their marriage widened. Pattie loved him deeply, but she couldn't compete with his spiritual obsessions, his affairs, or the demands of fame that seemed to swallow him whole. Still, she stayed, not out of weakness, but because she believed in the version of George she first fell in love with. Little did she know, the greatest test of her heart was yet to come, one that would shatter her world and entangle her life with another rock legend in ways she could never have imagined. By the early 1970s, the golden glow around George Harrison and Pattie Boyd's marriage had begun to fade. What was once a dreamlike romance had turned into something strained, fragile, and painfully human. George was changing. His devotion to Eastern spirituality had deepened, and his music reflected a man searching for higher meaning. But as his soul soared, his marriage slowly fell apart. Pattie tried to follow him into that world of gurus and meditation, yet she often felt like an outsider in her own home. Into this growing distance stepped a figure who would change everything: Eric Clapton. He had been one of George's closest friends, often visiting their home, jamming with George, and joining in the social circle that defined the British rock elite. But beneath the surface, a dangerous attraction was growing. Clapton had fallen hopelessly in love with Pattie Boyd, the very image of grace and beauty that had once inspired George. At first, Pattie brushed off Eric's advances. She adored George and couldn't imagine betraying him. But George's emotional detachment, coupled with his well-known affairs, left her increasingly heartbroken. In contrast, Eric's passion burned fiercely. He poured his torment into music, most famously into Layla, a haunting cry of unrequited love. The song became one of the greatest rock tracks of all time, and while the world celebrated it as a masterpiece, few knew it was really a confession, Eric's declaration of love for his best friend's wife. The love triangle became one of rock history's most painful and poetic dramas. Pattie, caught between two musical giants, was torn. George's infidelities, including his rumored affair with Ringo Starr's wife, Maureen, pushed her further toward Eric. The situation reached a breaking point when Eric confronted George, confessing his love for Pattie outright. In a surreal twist, the two men remained oddly cordial, perhaps bonded by the music and chaos that surrounded them. Eventually, Pattie could no longer ignore her own unhappiness. After years of trying to hold her marriage together, she made the agonizing decision to leave George. In 1974, their marriage ended, marking the close of one of rock's most iconic unions. But life with Eric wasn't the fairy tale she hoped for either. Though they shared a deep and genuine love at first, Eric's own demons, particularly his struggles with addiction and infidelity, mirrored the pain she had just escaped. Pattie once described her life with both men as being loved by two geniuses, but never truly being seen by either. Despite the heartbreak, she inspired some of the most timeless songs in music history. Something, Layla, Wonderful Tonight. These songs immortalized her beauty and her heartbreak, turning her story into legend. Yet behind every chord and lyric was a woman longing for peace, not fame. By the time the 1980s arrived, Pattie had endured enough of love's chaos. She began to rebuild her life, finding solace in photography and quiet reflection. Her story was no longer about being a muse. It was about rediscovering her own voice after years of being defined by others. After her divorce from George Harrison and the unraveling of her relationship with Eric Clapton, Pattie Boyd found herself standing alone for the first time in decades. The world still saw her as the face behind legendary songs, the muse who had inspired two of rock's greatest love stories. But Pattie, now in her 30s, was beginning to realize that her identity had always been tied to someone else's art, someone else's fame, someone else's emotions. It was time, finally, to become her own person. The early 1980s were difficult. Eric's descent into drug and alcohol addiction had left deep emotional scars. Their marriage, once fiery and passionate, became a cycle of pain and disappointment. Pattie described those years as living with a ghost, a man who was physically present but emotionally lost. She tried to help him, believing love could heal the wounds fame had deepened, but addiction had its own cruel grip. When Eric confessed to multiple affairs, including one with a model who would later bear his child, Pattie's heart finally broke beyond repair. In 1989, she left him, walking away from yet another love that had consumed her completely. For the first time in her life, Pattie was free, not as someone's muse or wife, but as herself. Yet the silence that followed was both liberating and terrifying. Without the chaos of fame, she confronted decades of buried emotions, loneliness, guilt, and the haunting question of whether she had ever truly been loved for who she was. Slowly, she began to heal. She turned to photography, capturing the world through her own lens for the first time. Her images, often of musicians and artists, reflected an understanding of beauty tinged with melancholy, a mirror of her own life. Friends described her as calmer, more grounded, and finally at peace with the past she once tried to escape. When George Harrison passed away in 2001, Pattie mourned him deeply. Despite everything, she remembered him not as the distant, conflicted husband of her youth, but as the gentle, spiritual soul she had first fallen in love with. Their story, for all its heartbreak, had shaped her life in ways she could never deny. Her reflections on Eric were more complicated. In her memoir, she expressed both empathy and sadness for the man who once worshipped her but ultimately hurt her the most. Yet even then, she held no bitterness, only the wisdom that comes from surviving great love and greater loss. By the time she entered her later years, Pattie had finally found her center. No longer the muse in someone else's song. She was the author of her own narrative, one defined not by tragedy, but resilience. Now in her 80s, Pattie Boyd looks back at her extraordinary life with a sense of calm that once felt impossible. Time has softened the sharp edges of her past, the heartbreaks, the betrayals, and the constant feeling of being overshadowed by the men she loved. In interviews and her writings, Pattie speaks with grace and introspection, no longer the timid young woman caught in the whirlwind of fame, but a survivor who has made peace with her story. When she reflects on George Harrison, her tone is tender and forgiving. "He was a beautiful soul," she once said, "but he was searching for something none of us could give him." She acknowledges that his journey toward spirituality often left her feeling abandoned. Yet she also recognizes that it was part of what made him who he was, gentle, complex, and deeply human. Pattie keeps fond memories of their early days, the laughter, the adventures, and the creative energy that surrounded them. Though their marriage ended, their bond, rooted in shared history, never truly disappeared. Her memories of Eric Clapton are more bittersweet. Pattie doesn't shy away from the pain she endured during their turbulent years together. She has said that while Eric's love was powerful, it was also destructive, a love that burned too bright and left scars. Still, she cherishes the music that came from it. Layla and Wonderful Tonight are not just songs of obsession and devotion, they are fragments of her life, echoes of moments when love was both her salvation and her undoing. But Pattie no longer defines herself by those songs. Today, she is celebrated not as a muse, but as a woman who lived through the chaos of rock's golden age and emerged with grace. Her photography, now exhibited around the world, captures a serenity she once sought in others. She finds beauty in quiet moments, a reflection of the peace she fought so hard to find. At 81, Pattie Boyd's truth is simple but profound. She no longer blames anyone for the pain she endured. She understands that the men she loved, George, Eric, and the world around them, were all products of a time when fame, temptation, and ego collided in extraordinary ways. "I loved deeply," she once said, "and even when it broke me, I wouldn't change it." Her story, once defined by rock legends, is now a testament to endurance and forgiveness. Pattie Boyd was more than the woman behind Something or Layla. She was a dreamer, an artist, and above all, a survivor of love's most dazzling illusions. As she grows older, her reflections remind us that even in the shadow of greatness, there is light to be found. And for Pattie, that light was never truly in the songs written about her. It was in the strength she discovered when the music finally faded.